when people talk about anti-Muslim sentiment or Islamophobia, there's always a real desire to sort of remove it from the larger issues of xenophobia, the larger issues of racism. But I think that we have to be careful about doing that. I mean, first and foremost, it's important to understand that nearly 2/3 of Muslims in the United States are first-generation Muslims. And so when we hear the kind of rhetoric that is used about Muslims in the United States, there's no question that it is very much tied to the overall anti-immigrant rhetoric that has become a staple, for instance, of the presidential elections. In fact, in many ways, I would say that Islam has become a kind of new other. It's become a byword for whatever is fearful, whatever is foreign, exotic. The truth of the matter is that I think that despite the fact that nearly 61% of Americans now have a negative view towards Islam, the majority of them probably aren't even sure what they mean when they say Islam. They're just kind of using Islam to mean this other thing, that which is not us, a common occurrence that happens in the United States in times of societal stress. I would say we're in one of those times. So there is, I think, a real sort of integration between the sort of racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and anti-Muslim sentiment. The other thing that I would say is that when you start to look at some of this rhetoric about Islam, it's clear that this is not just about Islam as a religion, but there is a real racial undertone to this conversation. I'll give you just one example, for instance. When you look at the kinds of things that are said by, for instance, the anti-theist ideologue Sam Harris. Sam Harris, of course, quite famously called for the profiling of Muslims. And then, you know, when he was accused of making a racist comment, very quickly said what most, I think, critics and most of his allies would say, which is that Islam is not a race, et cetera, and therefore he can't possibly be accused of racism. But if you actually look at the exact quote that Sam Harris gave, he said, quote, "We should profile Muslims and anyone who looks as though they could conceivably be Muslim," end quote. Now, I want you to think about that statement for a minute here, because essentially Sam means one of two things. Either he means we should profile everyone on earth. In that case, that's just a ludicrous statement. Or when he says people who look Muslim, he means something very specific. And if that's what he means, then it's racist. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what I would say here is to kind of start this conversation, that there is most definitely an intersection between the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment and the more general xenophobic, anti-immigrant, and racist sort of underbelly that has unfortunately, you know, reared ugly head over the last year or so in these elections.
Thank you very much. I think I'm just going to proceed in the order in which people are seated, and then we'll have comments from all of our panelists, and then we'll allow them some time to exchange with each other before we turn to the audience for some exchange between the audience and the panelists. So, Linda Sarsour, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
How are you?
I'm great, alhamdulillah.
Good.
Thank you, everyone, for having me here today. So for me, I think it's important to understand, I think I'm preaching to the choir when I say that for me, racism is bigotry plus power, right? So it's not just a bigotry where people walk down the street and they're like, I don't like that person because they're Muslim. For me, racism is systemic. And when the US government creates policies that target, quote, Muslims, right, that for me is racism. So when, for example, in 2003, when people, like 3 months ago, were outraged that Donald Trump said that he wanted to register Muslims, people didn't remember that in 2003 we already did that. We asked for Muslim males over the age of 16 who were from these particular list of countries who are not US citizens to come register with the US government, and then 10% of those men out of about 180,000 were put on deportation proceedings. So there are policies around the unwarranted surveillance of our communities by law enforcement and different levels of law enforcement, including revelations. I mean, they were revelations to everybody else, not to me, but of the New York Police Department's unwarranted surveillance of the American Muslim community, 250 mosques, businesses, cafes, butcher shops, our Islamic schools, our MSAs on our college campuses. So this idea of, having this kind of discussion about race, is that a term we should be using? Obviously, Muslims are of every race, and we're from every corner of this world, and including indigenous to the United States of America. But in the way that the system works, they have racialized us into one group of people based on this idea of some warped understanding of what Muslims look like and who we are. So for me, we are in a situation right now where we, as a Muslim community, need to understand and work from that premise. And I think it's really interesting that when the Islamophobes are attacking our community, they actually don't discriminate. They don't care if you're Shia, they don't care if you're Sunni, they don't care if you're South Asian, they don't care if you're Arab, they don't care if you're black Muslims, right? So they are, even the way that the bigotry is being projected against our community, it is being projected as kind of one thing. The NYPD wasn't like, we're going to leave the black Muslims alone and we're just going to do these Arabs and these South Asians. They were surveilling everybody. So I think it's important when we're talking about how to combat Islamophobia that we're not just looking at it from the perspective of that one crazy guy that strolls up to the mosque or the couple of white militias that come with the guns, that Islamophobia is systematic racism against Muslims, and that includes systematic racism against communities who are already being impacted by other forms of racism, including black Muslims in our community. And I think for me, one of the reasons why I am part of other social justice movements, including Black Lives Matter, is because I understand the community that I come from. 1/3 of my community is African American. So I'm not a white ally. Some of you might be white allies. I don't consider myself to be a white ally. I consider myself that these issues are issues that are directly impacting the community that I believe that I'm a part of. And I think that sometimes we need to learn from the bigots, right? They treating us all as one, and I feel like this is an opportunity that we're moving towards in the Muslim community, that we're being treated as one community, so we're going to start acting like one community. And I think building resilience and building unity across communities that may not have had close relationships over the centuries that Muslims have been in the United States of America, I think that's the positivity that I see that's coming out of this heightened Islamophobia and racism against the Muslim community.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Ahmed Khabir.
Yeah, I would sort of echo some of the things that have already been stated. You think about race, and we all know race is not biological, but it's a social fact, right, that has consequences. And, these consequences, and I think echoing what Dr. Aslan was saying, this notion of race being sort of what you look like, right, so kind of your phenotype, sort of, your physical features, this sort of thing, but also what you do, right? So we associate particular kind of behaviors with particular kind of racial groups. This is how Muslim becomes a race, right? Because they are brown, but they also pray, or they have beards, or they wear scarves, or, they do these particular types of things. So this is how we identify them as a racial group, and therefore then there can be consequences, right, that come with sort of embodying, right, that kind of physical and performative sort of ways of doing and ways of living. I think what's important, though, also about that in the U.S. context is the ways in which, the Muslim is not white, but the Muslim is not black either. And so here, I'm talking about sort of on several levels. So there's one level, thinking about particularly in terms of media representations, also sort of, sort of state acknowledgement, right? The Muslim is not white nor black because the Muslim has to be foreign, right? So this idea that, sort of white and blackness have become sort of nativized in the U.S. context, right? So erasing, right, actual indigenous people to this continent, to this world, to this place, but sort of making sort of white and black, well, that's who Americans are, right? So people who are not neither white nor black, well, they're other, they're foreign, they're the ones who immigrated here. So why does that matter? Well, because if the Muslim is foreign, then you're able to sort of create a sort of logic around surveillance, right? Because these people are foreign, they don't have our practices, they don't have our traditions, they don't look and act as what we do, so we have to sort of protect ourselves and make sure they're kind of, they belong. Or the Muslim is foreign and they are a sign of our exceptionalism as a nation, right? So anyone can make it here. They came from wherever they came from, they don't speak our languages, they don't have our traditions, but look, they're doctors, they're lawyers, right? This kind of myth of a model minority. And so this foreignness, right, sort of positioning the Muslim in the rhetoric as foreign, right, does work on both ends. So it sort of justifies regimes of surveillance, but also justifies regimes of multiculturalism in which people are accepted, but only if they act in appropriate ways, right? So they're appropriately minority, right? They do these things that we like, and we, sort of, and they fit in those ways. So I think for me, that's often a really important point to sort of emphasize, right, when we're thinking about anti-Muslim racism, and that's what I call it. So I don't call it Islamophobia, I don't call it anti-Muslim bigotry, I call it anti-Muslim racism because of the ways in which Muslim, right, has become a race, and then the kinds of consequences that come out of that. Consequences, of course, which are sort of kind of this kind of vitriol and violence, everyday sort of stuff, kind of like go home, right? Or like the community in Islamburg in New York, right, who was targeted by sort of the citizen vigilante who decided these people didn't belong here, they were a danger, so we have to target them. But also some of the apologetics that come out of Muslim communities, right? Sort of this way of sort of saying these assertions of belonging that are not critical about what home actually is, right? So they're telling you to go home. You're like, well, this is my home. But what home is this, right? Where do we live? One of the things that Linda said that I think is important to reiterate, right, is that yes, when the state surveils, while there is this image of the Muslim as foreign, when the state surveils Muslims, they know I'm Muslim, right? They know black people are Muslim, but they're not confused, right? And they haven't been confused, right? Because some of the earliest form of state surveillance of Muslims happened with COINTELPRO, right? Happened with the ways in which the federal government was surveilling, sort of infiltrating, and really trying to destabilize black Muslim communities, particularly the Nation of Islam. And so also when we think about this question of anti-Muslim racism and the consequences of that, not just from every day, but also the consequences of state violence and surveillance, we also need to think about this across a historical trajectory, right? So what's happening today is not, in fact, new. Like Linda said, she wasn't surprised. I wasn't surprised either, because I grew up thinking, well, they were tapping our phones anyway, right? So we have this sensibility that we know that people who figure themselves in society, in American society, in U.S. American society, and who are critical, right? Critical of the sort of continued erasure of indigenous people, critical of sort of the legacy of enslavement and racial discrimination that we have, critical of the ways in which sort of different groups of people are marginalized and sort of really bracketed out of what we call the United States. People who center themselves in that way are always sort of victims of kind of a particular kind of surveillance and violence that comes from everyday places, but also from the state. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Azeem.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor for me to be in a panel with experts with such great insight and commitment when I have worked considerably on the public debate of Islam in the West. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from Chicago. I was born and grew up in Scotland, and I've always been very comfortable with my dual identity, my multi-identity of being Scottish and Muslim. And as a teenager, I never gave it actually much thought, and that was up until the Bosnian War in the early 90s. I remember specifically the debate started to change in the mosques that, look, if Muslims, white, blue-eyed Muslims can be targeted simply because of their faith, and essentially us brown Muslims are going to be the next in line. And at that time, I volunteered for a charity to take a mobile bakery to Bosnia, and since that time, I've been working on counter-terrorism and security issues on both sides of the Atlantic. One of the projects I founded in Scotland was this thing here, is the official Scottish Islamic tartan. Those who are aware of tartan know that every single tribe, every single clan in Scotland has an official tartan, which is registered, and this is now the official Scottish Islamic tartan. And one of the people that advised me on this to help set this up is our own Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah from Chicago. And just to give you a very quick synopsis of what this actually is, the blue represents the flag of Scotland, the green represents the colour of Islam, the 6 gold lines represent the 6 articles of faith, the 5 lines, the 5 pillars of the faith, and the black square, the Holy Kaaba. The reason I'm showing you this is that this is the tartan, I set it up specifically for the purpose that it's an indication of the integration of Scottish and Islamic identity, 2 great civilizations that have made a huge contribution to humanity. One of the questions I get asked very often is what the chairman of the UK Conservative Party called the cricket test. You know, if England was playing Pakistan, what side do you support? Yeah. So I get asked very often that you're born in Scotland, you're of Pakistani origin, you're now in the United States, you're Muslim, where is your loyalty, where is your identity? And that question is fundamentally flawed because it assumes that we all have a single essence. But as the tartan demonstrates, that identity is like a pattern that's weaved together. Now in Europe, we're facing some considerable issues. Huge anti-immigration and racist xenophobia. Far-right parties in countries that are some of the most liberal countries on earth. We're seeing the rise of some extremist parties. And much of it is actually down to economic reasons. Europe is in complete economic stagnation, massive amounts of youth unemployment. And when something like that happens in any society, the first port of call of blame is always blame the foreigners, blame the immigrants. And in the UK, for example, we have this extreme far-right party called the UKIP, the UK Independence Party, that wants to stop all immigration, wants to pull out the European Union. Now, the interesting thing is the areas in which the UKIP is most popular are the areas where there's the least immigration, and it's the least amount of foreigners living there. And it's actually very similar in the United States. A majority of people in the United States believe that they have never actually met a Muslim. It's a bizarre situation. This is despite the fact that their cab driver is likely to be a Muslim, their physician is likely to be a Muslim. But when you tell them, oh, what about Abdul, who you work with? They say, no, Abdul's okay, he's not one of them. So the Muslim is this bogeyman that they have created that, that they've never ever met before. And it's the same thing in Europe as well, that Muslims are just this outside force, as was articulated very clearly. And we see this in the rise of in the Trump movement as well, the anti-Mexican, anti-Muslim xenophobia, that we only know ourselves through the eyes of our enemy. And anti-Obama movement as well. They accuse Obama of being a Muslim because it's politically correct, it's politically acceptable for them to say, well, look, he's actually a Muslim, despite the fact that during his campaign, one of the big scandals was with his pastor, because they simply can't, many of them simply can't say that, well, look, we're just not happy with black kids running around in the Rose Garden. Because to many white people, it is a zero-sum game. Either they have the power simply cannot be shared. And I'm happy to continue the conversation over the questions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, before we continue, I want to make sure that Professor Aslan, can you hear the presentations?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes. I can hear.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Before we turn it over to the audience, I want to sort of pose two questions, and if any of you want to sort of indulge each other along the way, that's fine as well. But one about the past and one about the future. With regard to the past, I think, Suhaid, you mentioned something to this effect, that the whole business of surveilling Muslim communities is not something new. Within the context, however, of Muslim communities as they've evolved in America, race has not always been a salient category with which to talk about the relationship between Muslims and the dominant culture. And so my question is in part, is there a new level of comfort with identifying Muslims with race, and is that a post 9/11 phenomenon? Or are we simply looking at this sort of natural evolution of the Muslim community into ever higher levels of maturity and understanding about America as a place, as a location in which race is inscribed sort of ontologically on the reality that we live? What's going on with this new degree, or what I see in some sense as this new degree of comfort with race as a salient category with which to discuss our position in American society at this particular point?
Well, I mean, I guess I would split that. So one, I don't think that race has never been a salient category is new. So I would say that, so sort of from the dominant society, so sort of mainstream white America, the Muslim has always been raced. Mid-century, pre sort of 1970s, and then sort of with U.S. sort of investment, imperial investment in the Middle East, right? It was the black Muslims, and they were the black Muslims, right? And one of the famous things is Mike Wallace in sort of 59,
yes,
right? They hate produce, right? And sort of it was the black Muslims, and the black Muslims, and they were different from these other Muslims, right? And so I think from the dominant society, race has always been a category. Likewise, in terms of the ways in which, and sort of the Orientalism, right, the ways in which sort of white mainstream America has seen sort of Muslims and related them to the Middle East. They were always non-white. There were these brown people. Maybe they were genies in a bottle at one point. This kind of thing. So there's that. So I think race has always been a way in which mainstream white American society has understood Muslims and Islam. I think the salience of race maybe have shifted on some levels in terms of how Muslims themselves see themselves in relationship to dominant society.
That was the point.
Okay, right. So I think, so in that way, I think that you have, so again, I think for Muslims from this part of the world who are of African descent, I think race has always been a salient category in how they understood themselves as a Muslim in relation to the dominant society, and also the ways in which they understood themselves transnationally. I think in sort of Muslim immigrant communities, primarily Arab or Middle Eastern and South Asian, I think sort of their racial identity, sort of they may have seen themselves more in terms of vis-a-vis the United States, where there's a colonial relationship they have with Europe, right? But the United States is a place that you choose to come to, you immigrate to, and so sort of the notion of race not being necessarily how you understand yourself as a Muslim, yet we do have these instances, right, in legal cases, right, of Arab Americans and South Asian Americans sort of petitioning to be considered white, et cetera, because everybody knows, right, what are the advantages that come with being associated with whiteness in this country. I think, yes, sort of with 9/11 in particular, I think people seeing themselves as people of color, right, and sort of using that rhetoric, using that language to kind of navigate has sort of risen to prominence. I guess the only sort of downside to that that I see is what people call the domestication of racial politics. So I think there's an emphasis now. So yes, I'm an Arab American, for example. I'm a South Asian American. I see myself, and I'm articulating who I am as an American, yet my relationships, so my transnational relationships become sort of downplayed, right? And so then I'm no longer making, you know, one of the famous things about Malcolm X, right? He was like, you know, the issue with black people in the United States is not a civil rights issue, it's a human rights issue, right? This idea that there's a global connection, these transnational collections, that power operates in that way, and that's important for organizing and for mobilizing. I think for American Muslims, there's been a tendency to become really domestic in an effort to sort of get your rights, right? But then what happens to sort of your ability to sort of identify the ways in which your condition here is directly connected to someone else's condition there. And so I think that might be one of the sort of downsides to that.
I mean, so for example, I'm Palestinian. Like, we don't have race in Palestine. That's not a concept that we understand in the Middle East. And I think when we come to the United States and we think racism, we base it on what we learn, and we think racism is against black people. Like, that's pretty obvious to us. And on the issue of race, and one of the new evolutions of talking about race in the Muslim community, particularly amongst Arab Americans, is that we're doing the opposite of what some of the generations of Arab Americans did before us. So while people in the 40s were like, we want to be white, because they could be white, right? Because they were Syrian, they were Lebanese, they were Maronite Christians, they were blonde and blue-eyed, and it was very easy for them to say, we want to be white, and understanding that in this country being white means that you will have different privileges. But then as different types of immigration, waves of immigration came from the Middle East, I'm sorry, if you're Yemeni, you can't really be white, even if that's what the government says that we are. So for folks to understand that the U.S. Census, the way that our government perceives us from a place of documentation and demographics, is that anyone who's from the Middle East, including North Africa, which many people are black as Africans in North Africa and places like southern Egypt, they are considered white by the U.S. government, right? But that doesn't translate to the benefits that we see or the treatment that people who are Arab American or Muslims or, you know, obviously South Asians are put into a larger category of Asians, right, with East Asians. So there's been a new wave of, I think, a new generation of Arab Americans saying, look, we're not white. In 2010, the U.S. Census came to our communities and wanted us to do outreach. They wanted to count the people. So we said, you want us to count the people? We're going to count the people the way we want to count the people. You cool with that? They didn't understand what we were talking about. So we started a national campaign called Check It Right, You Ain't White. And it was a big shock to some of the older generation Arab Americans who were like, what in the heck are you doing? And we're like, look, we're not getting the benefits to our community. We're not being treated as white, especially in this post 9/11 America. It was 2010. We were going through the Ground Zero Mosque and the mosque oppositions across the country. I'm absolutely not going to call myself something that I'm not being treated as such. So we started that campaign, and now the U.S. Census is testing a category called MENA, Middle East, North Africa, which gives you an opportunity to identify with a region of the world, right? But I want to say that I think it's also the evolution of the social justice movements. We found out and I think this is more for immigrant Muslims, obviously black Muslims already knew all of this before we kind of came to the story, that the same people who, you know, justify murders of unarmed black people, right, are the same people who want to deport Muslims, are the same people who don't want undocumented immigrants. So we found out that we're all kind of connected together, and I think the social justice movement has allowed me to evolve into looking at things from a racial analysis that I didn't have before. So understanding to look at things through the racial analysis based on the context of the way we have evolved in this country, and I don't mean evolved always as a good thing, because I feel in some areas we're still in the same place. So I think it's an evolution of finding our place, especially as immigrant Muslims, as part of this larger kind of minority social justice and looking at things from a racial analysis, which we had to learn because we didn't come from that, from the places that our parents came from.
Professor Aslan, you're welcome to chime in anytime you want.
Well, I mean, and those were two wonderful statements. I don't really have too much to add, but the only thing that I will say is that I think that we forget that before the attacks of September 11, you know, a lot of the bigoted rhetoric towards people from the region was predicated on their ethnicity and their nationality. I mean, I came to the United States in the 1980s at the height of the Iran hostage crisis, and I was Iranian. So, you know, when I had kids make fun of me, or when I, you know, dealt with racism in my life as I was growing up, it was anti-Iranian racism. And then after 9/11, I was Muslim. And I think that's an important thing to understand, is that these categories of ethnicity and nationality, color, race, religion, are all extremely fluid, as Linda and Dr. Abdul Khadir have already mentioned.
Okay. Dr. Ibrahim?
So it's very interesting, you know, when I'm not in the United States, but since I've been here, is that the perception that many Muslims outside the US have of American Muslims. And I think we have to make a distinction when we say American Muslims between the Afro-American Muslims and the immigrant South Asian community. The South Asian community Muslims, which have in many respects a very large voice, very organized, are amongst the most elite minority Muslim community in the world. Yeah, the average South Asian, you know, Pakistani, Indian Muslim in the US is better educated and higher earning than the average American. That's a very unique situation that they're actually in. There's no other minority Muslim community in the world that has the same kind of privilege. If you look at Europe, for example, it's the exact opposite. Muslims are the bottom of every social economic indicator. In France, for example, they make up 6% of the population. They make up 70% of the prison population. In the UK, they make up 5% of the population, and they make up 11% of the prison population. And in the UK, they make up 44% in the maximum security prison population. So in a very different situation. And the Muslims in the US are in a unique situation in terms that if you look at the phenomena of minority communities in the US, you know, many of them go through a number of phases, and I know Dr. Omar, once again, he's done some research into this. The Jewish community went through the same thing. You look at even some of the old Hollywood movies like Gangs of New York and Once Upon a Time in America, you know, they're all ghettoized and compartmentalized and otherized for a significant amount of time. And they were only accepted as being part of the fabric of American society when it was seen that they are making a positive contribution to the society around them. And Muslims, particularly in Europe, are not seen as doing that. They're not seen as making any sort of contribution. They're seen much more as being those that being on welfare, taking a lot of out of society, enjoying all the freedoms but giving nothing back. And this is where Muslims in the US, I believe, are in a much better situation to actually make that contribution. And many of them are, but it's simply not being articulated into wider society. They are still seen as being others in society.
Yeah, sure.
I would just add to that. I think that this notion of these kind of stages of sort of integration in the United States, because that's what I can speak to most. I mean, you know, sort of Jews, the Irish, the Italians, well, they became white, right? And they had the possibility and the ability to become white, and so therefore they're able to be seen as they made contributions, right? I mean, whereas you have, say, sort of like, even say like Chinese Americans, right? Sort of, they may be model, but they're always minorities because they're perpetually foreign, right? And I take this from a sociologist, Claire Jean Kim, she talks about this notion of racial triangulation. So the idea being that, yeah, so they're better than black people, right? Because they have good families and they have a hard work ethic, whatever, right? But they're not Native, and they'll never be Native. And so they'll never actually have that kind of position where their sort of belonging won't be questioned. And so I think for Muslims then, and then for the South Asian community you're talking about, right, sort of they can sort of attain a lot of wealth and sort of positions of influence in terms of that. But whether or not they'll, I don't think they're going to be like the Irish. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that what's going to happen is that the sort of Americans as a sort of community are going to have to make some decisions about what they want this country to be like, and that will determine how people sort of fit.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add something? Okay, before I turn over to the audience, I wanted to ask one last question, and I want to sort of try to maybe complicate the picture a bit in terms.
Because it's so simple.
Yeah. We've been largely talking about issues of Muslims and race in the context of sort of how the Muslim community finds itself positioned vis-a-vis the dominant culture. I'm wondering, though, about the extent to which some in the Black American Muslim community may feel that this whole category of race is being so distended to the point that it becomes sort of nondescript, that we start talking about racism, and the people who benefit most from that rhetoric are not necessarily Black Americans, that the issues of Black American Muslims, even within Muslim communities, in terms of some of the racial discrimination that they experience, goes unaddressed while we continue to ramp up the rhetoric about racism regarding Muslims. What are some of your thoughts about that in terms of how we move forward in terms of addressing issues of racism both within the Muslim community and between the Muslim community and the broader society? And how do we get on the same page with regard to those two things so that we're not talking out of sort of both sides of our faces, as it were?
So I'll start with that. I think that's a challenge for us, Dr. Sherman Jackson. It's really a challenge, especially when we are, trying to stand up against anti-Muslim bigotry and racism and trying not to perpetuate the same stereotypes that people have about our community, that our community is Arab, that our community is South Asian, that we all look foreign. Like for me, for example, I'm Palestinian American. I consider myself to be indigenous to this land. Like I'm born here. Like no, I only have one passport. I'm not going to get deported anywhere. But at the same time, I have to also be honest to say that I don't reflect the large portion of the Muslim community. In fact, Arab Americans are a significant part of the Muslim community here, but we're not the majority. And oftentimes we are given lots of privileges, especially from the point of representation of our community. And I think that's extremely problematic. And I think that when the Muslim community in general, particularly immigrant Muslims, want to talk about racism, if we're not talking about ending mass incarceration, if you're not bringing up, police brutality and seeing that as your, quote, Muslim issue, like that ain't our issue, it's disingenuous and it's hypocritical, because if our community is 1/3 African American, we're saying mass incarceration ain't our problem, or it's important, right? That's horrible. Police brutality, that's horrible, but it's not our issue, but in fact it is our issue. And I think that I kind of gave up a little bit on the kind of a little bit of older generation of immigrant Muslims a little bit, and it saddens me a little bit, because I feel like there's too much work to kind of educate people about who they are and what their larger community is and what issues are, quote, Muslim issues. I don't even know what that means. I hate when people say that. And I'm like, what are our Muslim issues? Our issues are everybody's issues. But I think this new generation, this kind of up-and-coming generation, I'm talking about a little bit older than millennials, because I was born in 1980, so I'm technically still a millennial. But for those of you that don't think that, a little bit older than millennials, I think they're starting to understand that. Like, for example, I've been, I traveled to college campuses across the country, and I'm watching Black student unions, Black Lives Matter chapter, Students for Justice in Palestine, and MSAs doing joint programming to that, because they understand that their liberation is bound up together. It's not a concept that really, that our immigrant parents, understand. And I don't know if I have the time and resources to invest in trying to educate them, but rather do the work moving forward. But it's challenging, and I think that there's a lot of tension. I'm from New York City with a huge African American community, and I get to hear the frustration, like, oh, y'all mad now, but there was a but there was a kid that just got, brutalized by the police down the street from the mosque in Harlem. Y'all weren't there, or is he not that important to you? You know what I mean? And I'm hearing a lot of the elder black leaders telling people like me that you've been what we've been waiting for. Your father wasn't there. I mean, not meaning my father as in my specific father, but like your father wasn't there for us. We've been going through this issue. You're dealing with COINTELPRO 2.0. You were living. It's true. Like my father was living in the times of COINTELPRO, right? We were there in Amadou Diallo, right? You know what I mean? So we just got to be honest. And I think in our community we don't always want to be honest. And there's challenges. And there's anti-black racism within the Muslim community, right? Let's be real about that. I mean, there's a word that we use, and I'm very, personally, like, it's been 16 years since anyone said that word in my house, but that means I was 20 when they stopped saying it, which is a word that means slave, which is what Arabs used to describe black people, right? And when you tell your family not to use that word, they say, well, wait a minute, we all slaves to God. And I say, well, would you say that about a Palestinian? Would you say that about a Lebanese Muslim? They say, well, so this is real in our community, and I think the young people are finally standing up and saying, no, not in our generation, it's not going to happen anymore. So I'm hopeful.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Linda. Because actually, I didn't quite catch the question, so that was helpful. I guess I'll just add that I think it's also important to think historically, and I'm not a historian, but I do think it's important to think historically, because if even something sort of black, sort of brown, sort of using brown to speak in terms of this, in this instance, talking about sort of Asian American, Arab American solidarities, or something that have existed, right, in the past. Even something like the Nation of Islam would not exist, right, if it wasn't because of the ways in which, right, these kind of immigrants from a particular part of the world and these southern migrants met, right? We wouldn't have sort of the history of Islam in this country that we have if it wasn't for that. And so there were solidarities, and those were possibilities that existed in the past. And so I think that it's also, we might want to think about sort of resuscitating, or sort of kind of like digging up that history to kind of understand how that worked, to maybe replicate that in our own time as well. I think, this question of whether or not the emphasis, I think that whether or not the emphasis on racism as articulated by Muslim communities in the United States could actually make sideline sort of issues of anti-black racism only happens, I think, if we don't really understand what racism is. Right? Because I think if we understand how racism operates, we understand specifically sort of what Bell Hooks calls, right, the white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy. If we understand how that actually works, then I think black people won't be sidelined, because that would be impossible, right? I think maybe the question then is whether or not the kind of anti-racism work Muslims are engaged in is actually really engaging in the issue at hand, or are they just jockeying, right, for a particular kind of acknowledgement? And I think sort of that, and now that's what's happening, then yes, right? Like what Linda's saying, mass incarceration, oh yeah, that's bad, but what does it have to do with, deportations? Or people are going to split those things up. But I think if we have a sort of really sophisticated analysis of our condition, I think then sort of issues of anti-black racism, as well as anti-immigration, et cetera, people will see those connected and will be able to work sort of in solidarity to eliminate them.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Linda?
I think Linda raised some very, very salient points. And I think the black Muslim community in the United States has a right now to be frustrated and annoyed about the Muslim community jumping on the bandwagon at such a late stage. The United States is one of probably the most egalitarian societies I've ever come across. I had a student, for example, when I was teaching at the Harris School, who's from Pakistan, and she got an internship at the White House, and one of her jobs was to keep the diary of the president. And even when I visited the White House, I seen Korean Americans, Indian Americans, Pakistani Americans, people from all different colours and societies. And it was pointed out to me, like if you look at during the Olympics, you look at the Korean team, they look Korean. If you look at the Indian team, they look Indian. You look at the Brazilian team, they look Brazilian. You look at the American team, it looks like all of them. This is a very unique phenomenon.
Which one? Which team? Just kidding. Because I'm like the Olympic team.
But
is
the
black
fact
anyway.
is, this is a highly egalitarian society. But what always astonished me is the treatment of the black community. And this has gone unnoticed. And black Muslims have a right to say, well, look, Muslims now are only jumping on the bandwagon simply because it's now affecting them, and now they're all become anti-racist and anti-bigotry when this is being going on for such a long time. And this is hugely unfortunate. As the old saying goes, first they came for the communist, and then eventually when they came for me, there was nobody left to speak out. Unless you oppose racism and bigotry in every form, then eventually, there'll be nobody left to speak up for yourself.
Okay. Well, let's go to the audience and field some questions.
Do you know what time it is?
Oh, okay.
You made a comment about that some of these minority communities will never become the Irish, correct? Now, what's happening in terms of the demographics in the U.S. and that we're looking at a 2020 where there's a majority minority? How does that kind of work itself into your analysis?
I mean, I think that works itself into my analysis in terms of thinking about whether or not whether or not numbers will equal power, right? So if you look like a state like California, right, which is a significant sort of minority population, yet in terms, but in terms of the politics of California, right, there's a lot of sort of sort of minority sort of policies and legislation that comes out of the state of California, despite, right, the significant numbers of people of color that actually live in that state. Also, people talk about things like, what do black poverty rates look like if we include the incarcerated, right? So we already know it's bad, right? But what happens if we include people who are incarcerated? So I think numbers not alone is not going to change that, right? I think power is, and so this is why sort of contemporary movements that we have around Black life, but also sort of connecting these relationships is so important, because then if we can sort of translate those numbers into actual sort of political power impact, then we can shift those things. And that's why I'm saying I think it's not about whether or not we can get to a day where we're all Irish. Like, I don't think that's what we want. What we want is whether or not we can get to a day where the United States of America, the people who live here, sort of coalesce around a notion of sort of what this country should be that is really meaningfully inclusive and also restorative, right, in terms of the kinds of justice that needs to happen for all the different people, and particularly the indigenous people and the descendants of the enslaved, right, who sort of are the foundation of the country.
Yes, there was another question. Okay.
I first wanted to say that Linda and Reza, you're like real life heroes to me, so I'm so excited to be here. But my question is that a lot of these things that you guys have been addressing seems to speak more to urban America. Now, where I'm from, I live a few hours away from Chicago. I live in a very rural area. And the issues in rural America do not seem to be the same in urban America. And the things that work in urban America to help unite and to put forth these issues do not work in rural America, and I wanted to know what your opinions are on that.
Can you give us a couple examples or one example?
Oh, sure. Like myself, I'm actually atheist. I've been wearing hijab in solidarity for 4 years because in my town it is extremely conservative. People will say stuff to me because I've seen them say it to other Muslims. That's why I started wearing it, because if you're going to say that to them, you're going to say it to me, because we're all the same. And I think in rural America, people have this idea, like they're more territorial about their city. And you are an outsider. When you're urban, you can almost be ignored. You're just a face in the crowd. In rural America, you cannot hide that. So if someone comes into a grocery store with a niqab on, it's very uncomfortable for them. Very, very uncomfortable. And I think it's great that we're working on these urban issues, but I think at the same time we really need to work on these rural issues where that's where a lot of these first generation Muslims are.
I mean, well, so I'm from Brooklyn. We always want to make that clear. But but I teach Indiana, right, in West Lafayette, Indiana, which I suppose it's not rural, but to me, it's like but I know someone who lived a Muslim the Muslims who live there, because there's a university there, so a lot of times people immigrate and they're coming to study and that sort of thing, and they talk about the way things have changed for them, right? So initially, people weren't really there wasn't a lot of hostility, but things have become more hostile for them because in these kind of spaces, sort of what people know. people still call black people colored in Indiana, okay, right? So I mean, it's we're like, what year is this, right? But that being said, I think I'm forgetting whose quote this is, so I won't say it, but I'm going to paraphrase something. How is it that sort of, for example, poor whites, right, have always sort of why isn't that poor, like during slavery, right? Why didn't poor whites sort of organized with enslaved black people, right? Because they're all being screwed over in the same, right? And how is it sort of their investment in whiteness and developing this investment in whiteness actually has people sort of going against their own interests, right? And so I think that legacy sort of maintains itself, in particularly places like someplace like in Indiana. And so I think sort of what works, right, I think is really around, I mean, for me, it's all about sort of education, and not education like Muslims are people too, because I don't think that's useful, but education in terms of people understanding how is it that you're in this town that is no longer financially prosperous, for example, like if you're in the Rust Belt or something like that, how is it that actually happened, and who are the culprits for this kind of thing? Because I don't really think it's about religion in this case, right? It's about helping people to economics and help people understand. Like, so how are we in this situation? So we can sort of develop what to do, how to get out of it, right? And I think speaking to those concerns, right, is sort of in those spaces, which are different, like you're mentioning, than someplace like a big city. Yet, but they don't know any Muslims, so maybe this one or the one doctor in the town, right? But having these like deep feelings of resentment and hostility, and I think counteracting that by sort of trying to get people to understand sort of why are we here today? What are the sort of forces that brought us to this place so we can better sort of chart a way out of it?
Do you want to add?
No, it's a very interesting phenomenon. As I mentioned earlier, this is, to me, I've seen this around the globe, and it really just comes down to economics. No local politician in an urban area is going to say, well, look, the local factory's closing because of global economics, because of our poor policies and so on. Is always blame the outsider, blame the others. There's probably no Mexicans in your town, but they'll blame the Mexicans for taking all the jobs. And this is exactly what happens everywhere. You blame the outsider, you blame the you otherize other people, and we can see that in the anti-Islamic rhetoric in the media as well. The amount of coverage that it dominates, the media narrative. And if you look statistically, it's a fact that more people die with vending machines falling upon them than die from Islamic terrorism in the US. More people die drowning in their toilet than they actually die from Islamic terrorism. But if somebody living in an urban area that just watches Fox News will think that, oh my God, this battle is going on throughout the whole of the US, and eventually this is going to turn up at our doorstep. So we need to stand up against these Muslims and take a stand. And this is where all the anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim rhetoric actually comes from, and it's a phenomenon throughout the globe. Areas that are the least affected by immigration and by racism and everything else are the ones that actually espouse the most concern.
Just add one thing.
Yes.
So I don't venture to rural America, but but I will say this: I think that we sometimes stereotype. We do to people what people do to us. So we say, "Oh, rural America, that's all where all the white supremacist racists live." And I actually think that there are many parts of rural America that have been quite welcoming to immigrants. I've read many stories of communities, places where they're farmland. And I think what needs to happen, and I'm an organizer, so I always think about that human interaction. I just need to find that one friend, that one guy, that one woman that's like I build a relationship with. And I bet you that one woman's going to tell her sister-in-law, they're going to tell the guy down the street, they'll be like, we met this great Muslim family, we met this great Mexican family, and then all of a sudden it goes from one person to a little bit more. So I think not to give up hope on the individual interactions, that one store owner that treats you with respect. I think that I still have hope in humanity, and I don't like to do to other people. I don't like to say white people. I like to be specific about when I say white supremacy and white supremacists in particular. And then saying rural America. I mean, I live in New York. People would think New York was one of the most liberal cities, and we see some of the most xenophobic rhetoric coming out. I mean, for God's sakes, we gave you Donald Trump. That's New York City. So just want to put that out there.
Thank you very much for what's been a wonderful panel, all three of you. I have a small question. Pardon me? I'm sorry, brother. All four of you. All five of you. Are there examples that you can point to that show real, on-the-ground progress with people of color coming together, building power blocks, not just individual transformation in relationships, as Linda just pointed to, but real coming together and coming and overcoming the whole, getting the white supremacist kind of license to treat certain groups and mess on them. For example, what's happened in the UK on this issue? There was a period in South Africa where all the different racial groups that were struggling to get rid of white supremacy, apartheid, they really came together. And they were identified as black people. Coloreds identified themselves as black. Indians called themselves black. Their organizations were that. And that word wasn't the important thing. The important thing was that they'd all come together in a power movement that helped and ultimately overthrew the apartheid system. So are there other examples in this country that you can tell us about or in other parts of the world?
Absolutely. I think one of the challenges has been, and I think that we're overcoming, is that people were working on like different issues, like in silos. Like the criminal justice people were working over there. The people working on like this corrupt immigration system that we have were working over here. Environmental justice. Everyone was doing their own thing. Everyone's doing amazing work, but everybody was doing their own thing. But if there's environmental racism, we know where those things are happening. In poor black communities, in indigenous communities. Then people are doing undocumented working on detention centers. Then all of a sudden we were like, wait a minute, let's follow the money, right? So you start looking at the larger military kind of prison industrial complex, and you find out that the same people who are benefiting off of black folks are the same people benefiting off of undocumented immigrants in these immigration detention centers. So we're starting to see a lot of building of power between black, Latino, other communities of color, including Muslims, which of course include both black and Latino. And I think Chicago is a great example. Cleveland, Ohio is a great example. Anita Alvarez, hit the road, Jack. Tim McGinty in Cleveland, hit the road. And I think that was the power of these young people that started to be so intersectional, building power together. I've been organizing this movement in a police reform movement in New York City for 10 years. And when I watched in 2013, we passed something called the Community Safety Act, which created an inspector general for the New York Police Department, which is the largest police force in the country that didn't have independent oversight. And what happened was, we went in there under the Bloomberg regime, and we did the vote with the city council. We did all this organizing work. It was blacks, Latinos, Jews, Asian Americans, you name them, we were all there. And Mayor Bloomberg vetoed us. So we said, okay, we're allowed to come back one more time. And the same group of people went out and we organized again. And what Bloomberg did is he invested millions of dollars in candidates to run against city council members who actually voted with our legislation. But guess what happened? We went back again to the vote and organized on the ground, both on electoral politics to support the people that were supporting us on the Community Safety Act, right? Grassroots organizing, mobilization, big rallies, and then the day came again for us to vote in the city council, and guess what happened? We won bigger than we won the first time. So I fundamentally believe, and I think the only reason I do this work is because I believe in the power of the people. I believe that while people say, yes, the system is rigged and all that, I do believe that there is a part of the system that works, and the system is on the local level. And that's where I put all my energies. Yes, I am on the Bernie Sanders campaign, but I'm doing that because I want to be part of a political revolution. I want to be able to give voice to the issues that Bernie Sanders, we've been talking about $15 minimum wage in New York City for years. We got it, right? So these issues that are being talked about in the presidential level are things that people have already been doing. Bernie Sanders is not the savior of the progressive movement. He's not the savior of middle-class America, right? People have been on the ground, in particular people of color have been on the ground. So for me, it's a matter of believing in the power of the people, and I'm seeing that in places across the country, people shutting it down, not just from the perspective of shutting it down for inconvenience, but shutting it down and taking people out who are in power, who are oppressing our communities, and it's happening in every part of the country.
Wow.
I've heard senior security people in the United States talk about their abhorrence of Trump on the basis that Trump's anti-Muslim rhetoric undermines the ability to cooperate with the Muslim community in its own surveillance, which I get the logic, but it's strikes me as an incredibly corrosive approach. And I wonder if you could speak to that and to what that does within the community, and how we respond to that, because it's very appealing to folks who are very frightened about terrorism.
That's a great question. If you look at almost all the terrorist attacks, that have been thwarted in the United States, and actually, in Europe as well, almost in all cases, the intelligence came from the Muslim community itself. The intelligence services after 9/11 realized that there's a huge gap in terms of their intelligence gathering ability, and the only way is to win the trust over, from the actual Muslim communities themselves. So by alienating them and disenfranchising them, they're doing a huge disservice to their own actual security. But obviously, it's much more convenient for people to believe that, look, these Muslims is much less about increasing surveillance on the Muslim community than it is to punish them. It's collective punishment, and that's basically the mechanism by which they're thinking, is that, look, we need to basically make life a bit more difficult for these Muslims until they get back into line. So it's less about the security than it is about the punishment, and I think that's what Trump's rhetoric is essentially, trying to articulate.
But I think, sorry.
I was going to say, I think sort of what's, I guess, more corrosive to the relationship is the sort of, use of entrapment and informants in Muslim communities, right? So there's a young Muslim man right now who's in an induced coma, right, who was sort of in New York City, sort of, part of this case, right? And part of my work, I do performance, and so one of the pieces in my performance is sort of dealing with this question of sort of countering violent extremism. And sort of I looked at all these cases in which sort of young Muslim men were charged in the state of Illinois, in particular, for sort of attempted terrorist acts. And each of these cases had a cooperating source, a paid informant, right? So there's this kind of sort of creation of a problem, right, that the federal, local law enforcement are sort of directly involved in. And so I think if you want to think about corroding relationships, right, between sort of your local government or the federal government and Muslim communities, I'm not sure Donald Trump is the biggest problem we have here, right? I think if in fact, right, you're going to set up a countering violent extremism paradigm that is sort of based on the false premise that there is something specific and singular about Muslim communities that leads them towards terrorism, and you're going to place people in their communities to sort of get vulnerable people who have mental health sort of issues, people who are young, people who are trying to figure stuff out, right? Ex-convicts. You're going to pick the most vulnerable people in this community to sort of like entrap and then make your point, right? I mean, to me, this is the problem, right? And so Donald Trump is,
I just wanted to add, it's a Jekyll and Hyde relationship that we have with law enforcement agencies. I'll give you a great example, like Commissioner Bratton. So here we took out one guy, right, Ray Kelly, then Commissioner Bratton comes in, who, as people know, is the creator of broken windows policing and stop and frisk, right? So you bring back the guy who you ran on a platform saying that you're going to take out stop and frisk, but that's a whole other situation. But he had great PR around Ted Cruz, right? He went out and he said, not in my police department. I have 1,000 officers here doing great work, whatever. And I'm like, really, brother? Like, you're still spying on my community, but you want to come out and use this as a public relations opportunity. And I think what the, law enforcement agencies like the New York Police Department have done is that they are treating us as suspects instead of partners, right? And I have no problem with surveillance. If you have a criminal lead for criminal activity, terrorism activity, by all means, do your job. But to surveil 250 mosques, all of our businesses, I think, first of all, it doesn't work. It's been. But I want to say something else that the security experts are also saying. They're saying, oh my God, we got to get rid of Donald Trump because Donald Trump is, is firing up ISIS, right? They're using Donald Trump's commentary as a recruitment. And I'm like, really, people? They're using drones as recruitment too. They're using unjust wars and the instability that we created in places like the Middle East. So I think oftentimes we scapegoat that one guy, and we're, a lot of us are focusing on Donald Trump, and he's a demagogue, and he's an American fascist. But watching his supporters come out, he just pulled back the covers on what we already knew existed in our country. Now it's just bolder and more courageous in 2016 than it may have been 10 or 15 years ago. So Donald Trump, for me, has been outrageous, but there's like, I don't know what the terminology is. He like a blessing in disguise? Like we've been kind of waiting for it for. Yeah, he's just putting it out there. So now it's time for us to figure out how to address it.
Professor Aslan, you're taking an earful. Please feel welcome to jump in anytime. We have
Thanks.
one
Sorry,
question over
I
here.
didn't want to interrupt the flow of the conversation. I would just echo exactly what Linda said. I mean, I don't think that there's any. You hear a lot about the fact that Donald Trump's rhetoric, has the possibility of alienating and therefore radicalizing American Muslims. I don't really think that that's an issue. I mean, the truth of the matter is that the very small percentage of Muslims in the United States, about 1%, less than 1% really, are well-educated, well-integrated, well-assimilated, and they recognize that the rhetoric of Trump is part of a kind of, it's part of our election history. It's what we do in order to get votes in this country. I think the more dangerous issue is what's taking place outside of the United States, because particularly among many people in the Muslim-majority Middle East, for them, Donald Trump's rhetoric is just simply proof of something that they've known all along, which is that there is this very deeply embedded anti-Muslim sentiment at the very heart of the American culture. I'm so glad that Linda said what I've been saying for a long time, which is I actually really like the fact that Donald Trump is having the effect that he is having, because it becomes very easy, particularly those on the right of the political spectrum, to simply blame Donald Trump or to see him as some kind of outlier. But he is not an outlier. These are not fringe opinions. 40% of Americans agree with him about creating a national registry of Muslims. 51%, more than half of us, agree with him about barring all Muslims from entering the United States. 49% of Americans, so nearly half of us, agree with Ted Cruz that we should have armed patrols of Muslim neighborhoods. Let's stop pretending that these two gentlemen represent some kind of fringe movement within the United States. They are about as mainstream as it gets. I'm kind of tired of the media constantly asking how it is that Donald Trump has become so popular and has risen so high in the political spectrum. How? Because we agree with him. That's how.
That's basically.
Okay, I've been told we got to wrap up. One very, very quick question and a quick answer.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair for coming out here.
That's not quick enough.
The root cause, you mentioned the census and the percentages. Now, I believe it's from the media. Everyday hatred, more hate Muslims, hate blacks, hate African Americans, hate whites. What's the solution? How do we get at that root cause? And I know it's not a quick answer, but what is the strategies, what's the methods to go at it? Media is the driving engine.
We have a very talented panel.
All day.
We got a very talented panel. We'll get you some quick answers.
Well, I'll just be quick. I think one thing is creating your own sort of independent media. So one of the things, Rami, so I started this website, Sapolo Square, which is online sort of resource dedicated to African American Islam to really think about sort of who they are, why they matters, why that's important, to sort of create your own, tell your own story. I think this is also some of the work in a much larger platform I know Dr. Aslan is doing too, but I do think that's important. I think it's important, one, to know your story, two, to understand your condition critically and sophisticatedly, and then to create your own media to tell it yourself. I think that's one really important solution.
And just quickly, just to add on to that, I mean, we have all the luxury of social media, which is really how people consume right now. Barely people that I know have television. Barely anybody watches cable. And I think people are watching videos. I mean, you got Facebook. People are putting out these. And I tried it myself, and it actually was transformative. It works, and people are getting the messages out that way. And Bernie, for example, people say biased media, but he's been able to put his message out because he has all these young people putting out these videos and these memes and using all the whatever tools are at their disposal. So I think that's what we need to be doing too.
Okay, I'm told we have to wrap up right now. We had a number of outstanding questions that I'm going to apologize for not being able to get to. But I do want to give all of our panelists just 30 seconds to make a closing statement, if you like. So we'll start with Dr. Ibrahim.
No, just continuing on from what Linda's saying, I think you have to tell your story, otherwise somebody else will tell it. And the American Muslims are in a completely unique situation in terms of the society that you live in. You know, it is the most egalitarian society in the world. You have to educate yourself, you have to educate your children, you have to empower yourself, and you have to involve yourself in other movements. It can't just be Islamophobia or anything else. It has to be anti-racism. All sorts of bigotry have to be tackled. And when Muslims are seen as making a positive contribution to all society around them, then I think the environment will start changing.
I would just say I think that it's really important that we continue to understand sort of the position of Muslims in the United States historically and transnationally. Historically being, we have to understand the ways in which Muslims are situated and configured is linked to a much longer history of sort of white supremacy and imperialism and patriarchy and capitalism in the United States, and also to recognize how Muslims are also situated with those forces as a global phenomenon, right? And so to understand and organize in that way.
Yeah, you know, I walked in here today unapologetically Muslim, and I'm leaving here unapologetically Muslim, and I think that's the place and premise that I organize from, that as a person with self-worth and believing that my community deserves worth, and that we're not asking for any favors, and I organize from a place in social justice movements for all people that we are not asking for favors, we're asking for the God-given rights that we should all have. So I hope that that is the premise that we all organize, that we're all unapologetic about who we are and what we believe.
And last but not least, Dr. Aslan.
Well, I'll just say very quickly that at least from the responsibility on American Muslims' side, we need to become better at focusing not just on Muslim issues. I think that, you know, I talk to a lot of MSAs around the country, and whenever I talk to them about the kinds of activities that they're doing, it's always sort of the same thing. It's like Islam awareness and Palestinian rights, and you know, those things are important, but so is the environment, so is racism, so is poverty. And I think that Muslims have to recognize that until we start to put aside our concerns and start standing up for everyone else, it's going to be that much harder for Americans to see us as part of the solution instead of part of the problem.
Well, please join me in thanking our panel for a very wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, and I will turn things back over to...
Thank you, Dr. Sherman Jackson, for moderating that amazing discussion. I'm going to ask our panelists, at least those who are on site, to keep those 30-second wrap-up thoughts and tell the story down on second floor with our media partner. My friend Taylor, raise your hand, is going to help escort you down there for a quick interview, 5 to 6 minutes. And then you can move along. But we really want to capture that because that's the way we will be sending this out into the social media atmosphere, and you can all help do that and share it. Thanks so much. The workshops start at 10:30. The coffee, I think, has been refreshed down on 3rd, and lunches will be available when you come out of your workshop at 2nd floor and up here on 4th floor outside the dining room. Thanks so much.
Do you want this?